the final months of World War II, the Pacific Ocean had become the stage for one of the most brutal naval campaigns in human history. By early 1945, the tide of war had turned decisively against the Empire of Japan. Island after island had fallen to the advancing forces of the United States and its allied partners. American aircraft carriers dominated the skies. Massive fleets of warships pushed steadily closer to Japan itself. And soon, the next target would be the strategically vital island of Okinawa, located only a few hundred miles from the Japanese mainland. To Japanese military planners, Okinawa represented the last great defensive barrier before the war reached the home islands. Losing it would open the door to direct bombing raids and possibly even an invasion of Japan itself. Determined to slow the American advance at any cost, Japanese commanders turned increasingly toward desperate tactics. Among these was a strategy that would soon become infamous around the world: the Kamikaze attack. Kamikaze, meaning divine wind, referred to suicide missions in which Japanese pilots deliberately crashed explosive-laden aircraft directly into enemy ships. The idea was brutally simple. A single aircraft, flown by a pilot willing to die, could potentially sink or cripple a massive warship that had taken months or even years to build. Japan lacked the industrial power to compete with the United States in traditional naval warfare, but kamikaze attacks offered a terrifying form of asymmetric warfare. If enough aircraft could penetrate American defenses, the damage to the U.S. fleet might become unbearable. As the preparations for the invasion of Okinawa intensified in early 1945, Japanese air bases across the region began organizing waves of these suicide missions. Pilots climbed into aircraft such as the famous Mitsubishi A6M0, many of them modified to carry bombs or extra fuel for one-way flights. Briefings emphasized speed, surprise, and determination. The pilots were instructed to fly low over the ocean to avoid radar detection, approach the American fleet quickly, and strike their targets before the defenders could react. Japanese intelligence officers had studied the defensive armament of American warships for years. They knew about the heavy dual-purpose guns mounted on destroyers and cruisers. They knew about the rapid-firing 20mm cannons that lined the decks of many ships. And they were also aware of a relatively new anti-aircraft weapon that had begun appearing in large numbers across the American fleet: the Bofors 40mm automatic gun M1. Designed originally by the Swedish arms manufacturer Bofors, this weapon had been adopted and mass-produced by the United States during the war. Compared to smaller anti-aircraft guns, the Bofors fired a much heavier 40mm shell, capable of destroying aircraft with only a few hits. Yet early Japanese assessments did not always regard it as a decisive threat. Many planners believed that kamikaze tactics could overwhelm the defensive firepower of American ships. After all, a pilot who did not care about surviving might still reach his target even while taking damage. In theory, even if defensive guns managed to shoot down several aircraft, others might slip through the storm of fire and crash into their targets. That assumption would soon be tested in the skies over Okinawa. On April 1, 1945, American forces launched the largest amphibious invasion in the Pacific theater. Hundreds of ships from the United States Navy and Allied fleets gathered off the coast of Okinawa. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, aircraft carriers, transport vessels, and landing craft stretched across the horizon. From the deck of almost every major ship, rows of anti-aircraft guns pointed skyward, waiting. Among them were thousands of Bofors 40mm guns, mounted in single, twin, and quadruple configurations. These weapons formed a critical layer in the fleet's defensive system. American naval doctrine divided anti-aircraft defense into multiple zones. Long-range guns attempted to disrupt incoming aircraft while they were still far away. Fighter aircraft launched from carriers tried to intercept attackers before they reached the fleet. But if enemy planes broke through these outer defenses, they would encounter the dense fire of medium-range weapons, like the Bofors 40mm. It was here, in this lethal middle zone of defense, that the weapon would prove its true value. As the invasion unfolded, Japanese commanders launched wave after wave of kamikaze missions against the American fleet surrounding Okinawa. Aircraft approached low over the water, sometimes appearing suddenly on radar screens, or bursting over the horizon with little warning. On board American ships, alarms rang out and crews rushed to battle stations. Sailors manned anti-aircraft guns while officers shouted orders across the decks. Radar operators tracked incoming contacts, and lookouts scanned the skies for approaching aircraft. When the first kamikaze aircraft came within range, American gunners opened fire. The heavy 5-inch guns fired explosive shells that burst in the air, attempting to disrupt enemy formations. But as the Japanese planes continued to close the distance, another sound began to dominate the battlefield: the rapid, rhythmic thunder of Bofors guns. Each Bofors cannon fired explosive shells at a rate of roughly 120 rounds per minute. Crews fed ammunition into the guns using 4-round clips, loading them continuously as the weapon recoiled and fired again and again. The effect was devastating. Bursts of 40mm shells exploded around incoming aircraft, tearing through wings and fuselages. Pilots, who had expected to face scattered defensive fire, suddenly encountered a dense wall of explosions. In some cases, kamikaze aircraft were destroyed hundreds of meters away from their intended targets. In others, damaged planes spiraled downward into the sea before they could complete their deadly dives. For Japanese pilots approaching the American fleet, the sky itself seemed to erupt with fire. What had once appeared to be just another anti-aircraft weapon was proving to be something far more dangerous. The Bofors 40mm gun was not simply filling the gap between heavy artillery and light cannons. It was becoming one of the most effective defensive weapons in the entire fleet. And as the battle for Okinawa intensified, more and more Japanese aircraft would discover this reality the hard way. As the massive Allied fleet settled into its positions around Okinawa, the calm that followed the initial landings did not last long. Japanese commanders had been preparing their response for weeks, and now the first waves of suicide aircraft were already being fueled and armed across airfields in Kyushu and Formosa. For the pilots assigned to these missions, the orders were simple and terrifying. Take off, fly south toward the American fleet, find a ship, and crash into it with maximum speed and precision. There would be no return flight. For the fleet of the United States Navy, the danger was very real. Hundreds of ships filled the waters surrounding the island. Troop transports carried thousands of soldiers preparing to fight their way across Okinawa. Destroyers patrolled the outer perimeter as radar picket ships, positioned miles away from the main fleet to provide early warning of incoming aircraft. Battleships and cruisers provided heavy gunfire support for the troops landing on shore. Aircraft carriers launched fighters that patrolled the skies above the fleet. Yet despite these precautions, everyone knew that kamikaze attacks would come. The Japanese had already used the tactic in earlier battles, but now they were preparing to employ it on an unprecedented scale. The pilots flying these missions often used aircraft such as the Mitsubishi A6M0, a once feared fighter that had dominated the skies earlier in the war. By 1945, however, the Zero was no longer a match for modern American fighters. Instead, it had found a grim new role as a flying bomb. Many kamikaze aircraft carried a 250-kilogram bomb beneath the fuselage, turning the entire plane into a guided missile aimed directly at enemy ships. On the morning of April 6, 1945, one of the largest coordinated kamikaze operations of the war began. The Japanese called it Kikasui, meaning floating chrysanthemum. Wave after wave of aircraft launched toward the Allied fleet off Okinawa. Some came in small groups, others approached in larger formations. Their plan relied on numbers and surprise. If enough aircraft attacked simultaneously, they might overwhelm American defenses. At first, radar operators aboard the outer picket destroyers detected scattered contacts approaching from the north. The reports moved quickly through the fleet's communication networks. Soon, alarms echoed across dozens of ships. Sailors dropped whatever they were doing and ran to their assigned battle stations. Engines roared to life as gun mounts rotated toward the sky. Ammunition crews prepared stacks of shells and clips beside the anti-aircraft guns. Among these weapons were thousands of Bofors 40mm automatic gun M1, mounted across nearly every major vessel in the fleet. The Bofors guns had already proven effective earlier in the war, but the coming battle would test them like never before. As the first Japanese aircraft appeared on the horizon, American fighter pilots scrambled to intercept them. Many kamikaze planes were shot down before they ever reached the fleet, but others slipped through the defensive patrols, flying low over the waves where radar detection was more difficult. Within minutes, lookouts aboard several destroyers spotted the approaching aircraft. Dark shapes appeared against the bright sky, descending toward the ships at frightening speed. The first bursts of anti-aircraft fire came from the heavy 5-inch guns mounted on the larger vessels. These weapons fired shells that exploded in midair, sending fragments tearing through the sky. The goal was to disrupt the incoming formations before they reached the fleet. But kamikaze pilots were determined. Even when explosions rocked the air around them, many continued their dives. As the aircraft closed the distance, another layer of defense came alive. The Bofors guns began firing. Each weapon recoiled violently as shells streaked upward toward the attackers. Gun crews worked with practiced efficiency. A loader slammed a 4-round clip into the top of the weapon. The gun fired all 4 shells in rapid succession. Another clip followed immediately. The rhythm was relentless. Boom, 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 boom. Reload. Boom, 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 boom again. In the sky above the fleet, dozens of exploding shells created a deadly barrier of fire. One Japanese aircraft burst apart almost instantly as a Bofors shell detonated near its wing. Another plane caught fire and plunged into the sea only seconds before it could reach its intended target. Yet not every kamikaze was stopped in time. One aircraft managed to dive straight through the storm of gunfire and crash into a destroyer. The explosion sent a towering column of smoke and flame into the air. Across the fleet, similar scenes were unfolding. Some ships were struck. Others narrowly avoided disaster as incoming aircraft were destroyed only moments before impact. What soon became clear, however, was that the Bofors 40mm guns were responsible for a large share of the aircraft being shot down. Their explosive shells were powerful enough to cripple even a determined kamikaze pilot, and their firing rate allowed gunners to track fast-moving targets effectively. Japanese pilots who had been told that American defenses could be penetrated began encountering something very different. As they approached the fleet, the sky filled with flashes of orange explosions. Aircraft flying only a few hundred meters apart suddenly vanished in bursts of fire. Wings tore away, engines erupted into flames. For those pilots who survived long enough to see it, the realization must have been terrifying. The American fleet was not protected by a few scattered guns. It was surrounded by a dense web of anti-aircraft fire, and at the center of that web were the Bofors guns. Throughout April and May of 1945, the kamikaze attacks continued. Day after day, Japanese aircraft attempted to break through the fleet's defenses. Radar picket ships often suffered the heaviest attacks because they were positioned farthest from the main fleet and were easier to isolate. Many of these destroyers fought desperate battles, firing every weapon they had while kamikaze aircraft dove toward them from multiple directions. In these moments, the Bofors guns proved indispensable. Their range filled the gap between the heavy 5-inch guns and the smaller 20mm cannons. They were powerful enough to destroy aircraft quickly, yet fast enough to engage targets moving at high speed. Over time, American crews grew increasingly confident in the weapon. Sailors who had once viewed the gun as simply another piece of equipment began to recognize it as one of the fleet's most reliable defenses. And for the Japanese pilots still flying toward Okinawa, the lesson was becoming painfully clear. The weapon they had underestimated was turning the skies above the American fleet into a killing zone. By mid-April 1945, the battle raging around Okinawa had evolved into something unlike any previous naval engagement in the Pacific. The invasion of the island was still underway on land, but at sea, another brutal struggle was unfolding. For the ships of the United States Navy, the real danger no longer came from enemy battleships or submarines. It came from the sky. Japanese commanders had committed themselves fully to the kamikaze strategy. Hundreds of aircraft were being launched in successive waves from airfields across southern Japan. Some were fighters like the Mitsubishi A6M0, while others were dive bombers or obsolete training planes pressed into service as suicide weapons. Each carried explosives, and each was flown by a pilot who had already accepted that he would never return. The goal was simple: overwhelm the American fleet through sheer persistence. Even if most aircraft were shot down, the few that slipped through could still cause devastating damage. For the sailors aboard American ships, this meant living under constant threat. Radar screens were watched every minute of every day. Lookouts scanned the horizon from dawn until nightfall. Any unidentified aircraft could be the beginning of another attack. When the alarm sounded, every crew member knew exactly where to go. Gunners rushed to their mounts. Ammunition handlers prepared stacks of shells and clips. Engines roared as ships maneuvered to present the smallest possible target. At the center of this defensive network were the thousands of Bofors 40mm automatic gun M1 guns mounted across the fleet. What had once been considered just another anti-aircraft weapon was now proving to be one of the most important tools for survival. The Bofors gun filled a critical role in naval defense. Heavy guns like the 5-inch batteries were powerful but slower to track fast-moving aircraft. Smaller weapons, such as the 20mm cannons, fired rapidly but lacked the explosive power to destroy larger planes quickly. The Bofors struck the perfect balance. Its shells were large enough to tear apart an aircraft with only a few hits, yet the gun could fire rapidly enough to track a diving target. This balance made it especially deadly against kamikaze aircraft. As the kamikaze campaign intensified, American sailors began referring to the defensive fire around their ships as a wall of steel. When incoming aircraft were detected, the fleet's anti-aircraft guns opened fire in carefully layered patterns. First came the heavy guns, firing timed explosive shells at long range. Then, as the attackers closed in, the Bofors guns began firing in massive numbers. From every direction, streams of glowing shells streaked upward into the sky. To an approaching pilot, the effect must have been terrifying. Instead of facing a few isolated bursts of defensive fire, they were confronted by hundreds of explosions, forming a deadly barrier between their aircraft and the ships below. Even the most determined kamikaze pilot had to fly through that barrier to reach his target. One afternoon in April, a group of Japanese aircraft approached the American fleet at low altitude, hoping to avoid radar detection. The formation had been briefed carefully before takeoff. The pilots were told that if they maintained speed and flew directly toward their targets, at least a few of them might get through. But as they rose over the horizon and the ships of the American fleet came into view, they also saw something else. The sky above the fleet was already filled with bursts of anti-aircraft fire. Heavy shells exploded in the distance, while fighter aircraft swooped in to attack the formation. Several Japanese planes were shot down immediately by American fighters. The survivors pressed forward. Soon they were close enough to see the warships clearly. Battleships and cruisers cut through the water below them, while destroyers maneuvered rapidly across the surface of the sea. Then the Bofors guns opened fire. From dozens of ships, the weapons began firing simultaneously. The rhythmic thunder of the guns echoed across the ocean as shell after shell streaked toward the incoming aircraft. Explosions erupted all around the formation. One Japanese plane suddenly disintegrated in midair when a 40mm shell detonated near its engine. Another aircraft lost part of its wing and began spinning uncontrollably toward the water. Yet the surviving pilots continued their dives. One kamikaze aircraft broke through the outer layers of defensive fire and aimed directly at a destroyer below. The pilot pushed the engine to maximum power and angled the aircraft downward in a steep attack run. On the destroyer's deck, the Bofors gun crews tracked the incoming aircraft with intense concentration. The gunner adjusted his aim while the loader fed clip after clip of ammunition into the weapon. The gun fired again and again, the recoil shaking the entire mount. At the last possible moment, several shells struck the aircraft. Flames burst from the engine. The plane lost control and crashed into the ocean only a short distance from the ship. A towering column of water erupted beside the destroyer, drenching the deck but leaving the ship intact. Across the fleet, similar scenes were unfolding. Kamikaze pilots continued to attack with remarkable determination, but the defensive firepower of the American fleet was proving extremely difficult to penetrate. The Bofors guns, in particular, were responsible for destroying large numbers of incoming aircraft before they could reach their targets. American sailors quickly learned to trust the weapon. Crews trained constantly to improve their reaction times and coordination. Gunners practiced tracking fast targets, while loaders worked to maintain a steady stream of ammunition. During major attacks, some guns fired hundreds of rounds in only a few minutes. The decks around the gun mounts often became littered with empty shell casings as the battle raged. Despite the effectiveness of these defenses, the danger never completely disappeared. Some kamikaze aircraft still managed to reach the fleet. Several American ships were struck during the Okinawa campaign, and many sailors were killed or wounded in the explosions that followed. But the defensive wall of fire created by the fleet's anti-aircraft guns dramatically reduced the number of aircraft that succeeded. And at the heart of that defensive wall stood the Bofors 40mm gun, firing relentlessly as wave after wave of attackers attempted to break through. For Japanese pilots approaching the battlefield, the reality was becoming impossible to ignore. What had once seemed like just another defensive weapon had become one of the greatest obstacles standing between them and their targets. The gun they had underestimated was now turning the skies above Okinawa into one of the most dangerous places any pilot could enter. By late April 1945, the struggle surrounding Okinawa had become one of the most intense naval air battles ever fought. While soldiers battled across the rugged terrain of the island itself, a different kind of war was unfolding offshore. It was a war defined by radar screens, sudden alarms, and the terrifying scream of diving aircraft. The ships of the United States Navy were now operating in a defensive system designed specifically to detect and destroy incoming Japanese air attacks before they could reach the main invasion fleet. At the outer edge of this defensive network were the radar picket ships. These vessels, usually destroyers supported by smaller escort ships, were positioned many miles away from the main fleet. Their job was extremely dangerous, but absolutely essential. Equipped with radar equipment, these ships served as the fleet's early warning system. If Japanese aircraft were detected approaching from long distance, the radar pickets would report the contact and give the rest of the fleet time to prepare its defenses. But the position of these ships also made them prime targets. Because they were stationed far from the main body of the fleet, radar pickets often faced kamikaze attacks almost alone. Japanese pilots knew that if they could destroy these ships, they might blind the American fleet and open a path for later attacks. As a result, the radar picket destroyers off Okinawa endured some of the heaviest air attacks of the entire war. Day after day, waves of kamikaze aircraft searched for these isolated ships on the horizon. For the sailors stationed aboard the picket destroyers, life became a constant cycle of tension and sudden violence. Radar operators stared at their screens for hours at a time, searching for faint signals that might indicate incoming aircraft. When a contact appeared, the warning was transmitted across the fleet within seconds. Fighters were launched from nearby carriers, while anti-aircraft crews rushed to their battle stations. Among the weapons preparing to defend these ships were the familiar mounts of the Bofors 40mm automatic gun M1, which had already proven their worth during earlier attacks. Yet, on the radar picket line, these guns would face their greatest test. One afternoon, radar operators aboard a picket destroyer detected several contacts approaching rapidly from the north. The signals were moving fast and flying low over the water, a common tactic used by Japanese pilots to reduce the time available for defenders to react. The warning was immediately sent to the rest of the fleet, but for the picket ship itself, there was little time to wait for help. Within minutes, lookouts spotted the incoming aircraft. Dark silhouettes appeared against the bright sky, descending toward the ship with frightening speed. The alarm sounded across the destroyer. Sailors rushed to their stations as engines pushed the ship into evasive maneuvers. Anti-aircraft guns began tracking the incoming aircraft almost immediately. The heavy 5-inch guns fired first, launching explosive shells toward the approaching planes. Some of the attackers were forced to change course to avoid the bursts, but others continued straight toward the ship. Their pilots focused entirely on the final moments of their mission. As the distance closed rapidly, the Bofors guns opened fire. The weapon's distinctive rhythm echoed across the deck as the gun crews worked with intense concentration. A loader fed a clip of 4 shells into the weapon. The gun recoiled violently as it fired each round in rapid succession. Another clip followed immediately. The gunner adjusted his aim constantly as the aircraft approached. In the sky above the destroyer, explosions began to bloom around the incoming planes. One aircraft was struck directly by a 40mm shell and disintegrated almost instantly. Debris scattered across the sky as the wreckage plunged into the ocean. Another plane caught fire and veered sharply away before crashing into the sea several hundred meters from the ship. But the attack was not over. A third aircraft managed to dive through the defensive fire, racing toward the destroyer at full speed. On the deck below, every available gun was firing. The Bofors mounts tracked the incoming plane with desperate precision. Shell after shell streaked upward toward the target. At the last moment, the aircraft was struck repeatedly by exploding shells. Flames erupted from the fuselage, and the plane spiraled downward before reaching the ship. It slammed into the water so close that the explosion rocked the destroyer violently. Even though the ship survived the attack, the message was clear. These battles were being fought at extremely close range, and survival often depended on the speed and accuracy of the ship's anti-aircraft defenses. In these moments, the Bofors guns proved to be one of the most reliable weapons available to the crew. Their explosive shells were powerful enough to destroy aircraft quickly, while their rapid rate of fire allowed gunners to engage fast-moving targets before they could complete their dives. Across the radar picket line, similar encounters were occurring again and again. Destroyers and escort ships fought desperate battles against waves of incoming aircraft, relying heavily on their Bofors guns to defend themselves. Some ships were struck despite their best efforts, suffering heavy damage and casualties. Others managed to survive repeated attacks thanks to the relentless firepower of their defensive guns. For Japanese pilots approaching these isolated ships, the experience could be terrifying. They had been trained to strike quickly and decisively, but instead they often found themselves flying into an intense storm of anti-aircraft fire. Explosions surrounded their aircraft as they attempted to line up their final dive. Many planes never reached their targets at all. As the weeks passed and the battle for Okinawa continued, the radar picket line became known among American sailors as one of the most dangerous assignments in the Pacific War. Yet it was also a place where the effectiveness of the Bofors gun became undeniable. Time after time, these weapons helped destroy incoming aircraft before they could strike their targets. What had once been underestimated by Japanese planners had now become one of the most feared defensive weapons in the American fleet. And as the Kamikaze campaign continued, the skies above Okinawa would remain filled with the thunder of those guns. By May 1945, the battle around Okinawa had reached a brutal rhythm that seemed almost unreal to the men living through it. For weeks, the ships of the United States Navy had been locked in a constant cycle of tension and violence. Radar operators scanned their screens day and night, searching for the first signs of approaching aircraft. Lookouts watched the skies until their eyes ached. Gun crews slept beside their weapons, knowing that the next alarm could sound at any moment. The Kamikaze campaign, launched by Empire of Japan, showed no signs of slowing. In fact, it seemed to grow more desperate with each passing week. Japanese commanders continued launching waves of aircraft toward the fleet surrounding Okinawa, hoping that persistence alone might eventually break the American defenses. The attacks came at all hours. Sometimes they arrived in the early morning, when the sun was just beginning to rise over the ocean. Other times they appeared suddenly in the late afternoon or even at night, when the darkness made detection more difficult. For the sailors defending the fleet, every contact on radar could mean the beginning of another life-or-death struggle. By this stage of the campaign, American crews had become highly experienced in anti-aircraft defense. They knew the sound of approaching aircraft. They recognized the shape of incoming planes against the clouds. Most importantly, they had learned to trust the weapons protecting their ships, especially the Bofors 40mm automatic gun M1. The gun had become one of the most important parts of the fleet's layered defensive system. Heavy guns attempted to disrupt attackers at long range, while smaller weapons fired when aircraft came dangerously close. But the Bofors filled the critical middle distance, where kamikaze aircraft were still moving fast but had not yet reached their final dive. In this zone, the weapon was devastatingly effective. One afternoon, shortly after noon, radar operators aboard several ships detected a large group of aircraft approaching from the north. The contacts were numerous and moving quickly. Within seconds, the warning spread across the fleet. Sirens echoed across the decks of dozens of ships as crews rushed to their battle stations. Fighter aircraft launched from nearby carriers, racing toward the incoming formation in an attempt to intercept it before it reached the fleet. But the Japanese pilots had learned from previous attacks. Many of them were flying extremely low, skimming just above the waves in order to reduce the distance they had to travel under fire. As the aircraft rose over the horizon, the ships of the fleet became visible to them for the first time. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and carriers stretched across the ocean below. From the perspective of the attacking pilots, the ships might have seemed like easy targets waiting beneath them. But within seconds, the sky above the fleet exploded with anti-aircraft fire. The heavy 5-inch guns opened first, sending timed explosive shells into the path of the incoming aircraft. Dark bursts of smoke filled the air as fragments tore through the formation. Several Japanese planes were struck immediately and began falling toward the ocean. The remaining aircraft pressed forward, diving lower and accelerating toward their targets. That was when the Bofors guns began firing. Across the decks of dozens of ships, hundreds of Bofors 40mm guns opened fire almost simultaneously. Their rapid rhythm echoed across the ocean as shells streaked upward toward the attackers. Each shell carried an explosive charge powerful enough to rip apart an aircraft with only a single well-placed hit. Gun crews worked with intense speed and coordination. Loaders fed clip after clip of ammunition into the weapons, while gunners tracked the fast-moving targets above them. The recoil of the guns shook the mounts as shells flew toward the incoming planes. Within moments, the sky above the fleet was filled with explosions. To the Japanese pilots, it must have looked like a storm of fire. Aircraft flying side by side suddenly vanished in bursts of flame as shells detonated around them. One plane lost its wing and tumbled into the ocean. Another erupted in flames before it could begin its dive. Yet some pilots continued forward despite the chaos. One kamikaze aircraft broke through the outer layers of defensive fire and aimed directly at a large cruiser. The pilot pushed the engine to its limits and angled the aircraft downward in a steep attack. On the cruiser's deck, several Bofors gun crews locked onto the incoming target. The gunner adjusted the aim carefully as the aircraft closed the distance. The loader slammed another clip into the weapon, and the gun fired again and again. Exploding shells surrounded the aircraft as it raced toward the ship. At the last possible moment, several shells struck the plane directly. The aircraft erupted into flames and broke apart in midair. The wreckage crashed into the ocean only seconds before it could reach the cruiser. Across the fleet, similar scenes were unfolding. Kamikaze aircraft attempted to break through the defensive barrier again and again, but many were destroyed before they could complete their dives. The Bofors guns were responsible for a large share of these kills. Their balance of firepower, accuracy, and firing speed made them one of the most effective anti-aircraft weapons in the fleet. By the end of the day, dozens of Japanese aircraft had been shot down. Some ships had suffered damage, and a few had been struck by kamikaze attacks that managed to slip through the defenses. But the majority of the attacking planes had been destroyed before reaching their targets. Among American sailors, the reputation of the Bofors gun continued to grow. Crews knew that when the weapon opened fire, their chances of surviving the attack increased dramatically. For Japanese pilots, however, the situation looked very different. Each new attack revealed the same deadly pattern. As they approached the fleet, they were forced to fly through an increasingly dense storm of exploding shells. Many aircraft were destroyed long before they could even begin their final dive. The weapon that had once been underestimated was now proving itself again and again. The skies above Okinawa had become one of the most dangerous battlefields of the entire war, and much of that danger came from the relentless firepower of the Bofors guns guarding the American fleet. By the final weeks of the battle around Okinawa, both sides had begun to understand exactly what kind of war they were fighting. For the commanders of the Empire of Japan, the Kamikaze campaign had become a desperate gamble. Their navy had already been shattered by years of combat, and their air force had lost many of its experienced pilots. What remained was a strategy built on sacrifice. If enough aircraft could reach the Allied fleet, they might still slow the American advance toward Japan itself. For the men aboard the ships of the United States Navy, survival depended on something very different: coordination, discipline, and the relentless firepower of their anti-aircraft defenses. Every day the fleet remained off Okinawa meant facing new waves of incoming aircraft. The kamikaze pilots continued to come, sometimes in small groups and sometimes in large coordinated attacks. They approached from different directions, flying low over the ocean or diving from high altitude. The tactic was unpredictable, and that unpredictability made it deadly. Yet by this stage of the campaign, American sailors had gained valuable experience. Gun crews had fired thousands of rounds in combat. Radar operators had learned to identify incoming threats more quickly. Fighter pilots had refined their interception tactics, and across the decks of the fleet, one weapon had earned a reputation that few others could match: the Bofors 40mm automatic gun M1. The Bofors gun had originally been designed by the Swedish arms manufacturer Bofors, but during the war it was produced in enormous numbers by American industry. Factories across the United States manufactured thousands of these guns, along with millions of rounds of ammunition. By 1945, they had become a standard part of the defensive armament on nearly every major American warship. What made the weapon so effective was its balance of characteristics. The 40mm shell was powerful enough to destroy most aircraft with only a few hits. At the same time, the gun's automatic firing mechanism allowed it to maintain a high rate of fire, roughly 120 rounds per minute under ideal conditions. This combination gave gunners the ability to track and destroy fast-moving targets at medium range, exactly the kind of threat posed by kamikaze aircraft. During the Okinawa campaign, the value of this weapon became increasingly clear. When Japanese aircraft approached the fleet, they first encountered long-range defenses such as fighter interceptors and heavy naval guns. But if they managed to slip through these outer layers, they still had to pass through the deadly zone covered by the Bofors guns. In that zone, the sky itself often seemed to erupt with explosions. Hundreds of shells could be fired in a matter of seconds as multiple ships engaged incoming targets simultaneously. The result was a dense barrier of fire that many aircraft simply could not survive. American sailors began to describe the defensive fire around their ships as a ring of steel. When a kamikaze aircraft entered that ring, its chances of reaching the ship below dropped dramatically. One destroyer officer later described watching the Bofors guns in action during a major attack. As several Japanese aircraft dove toward the fleet, the guns opened fire from every direction. Streams of glowing shells streaked upward while bursts of orange explosions surrounded the attackers. Within seconds, one plane exploded in midair, another lost control and plunged into the sea. A third aircraft managed to continue its dive for several more seconds before a series of shells struck its fuselage and tore it apart. The wreckage splashed into the water only a few hundred meters from the ship. Encounters like this were repeated again and again throughout the battle. While some kamikaze aircraft still succeeded in striking their targets, many more were destroyed before they could complete their attack runs. Reports from the campaign later indicated that a large portion of these kills were credited to the fleet's medium-range anti-aircraft weapons, especially the Bofors guns. For the sailors operating these weapons, the experience was both exhausting and intense. During major attacks, gun crews sometimes fired continuously for several minutes while aircraft approached from multiple directions. Loaders worked furiously to keep the ammunition flowing, while gunners tracked targets through clouds of smoke and exploding shells. The deck around the gun mounts quickly became littered with empty shell casings. The air filled with the smell of gunpowder and burning fuel from destroyed aircraft. Yet even in these chaotic conditions, the Bofors guns continued to perform with remarkable reliability. Their mechanical design proved durable enough to withstand the stress of prolonged combat, and their accuracy allowed skilled crews to engage targets with impressive effectiveness. Over time, many sailors began to see the weapon as more than just another piece of equipment. It had become one of the fleet's most trusted defenders. By the end of the Okinawa campaign, the scale of the kamikaze attacks had been staggering. Japanese forces launched thousands of sorties against the Allied fleet, and hundreds of aircraft attempted suicide dives against American ships. Some succeeded, causing serious damage and heavy casualties. Yet many more were destroyed before they could reach their targets. The defensive firepower of the fleet, particularly the Bofors guns, played a crucial role in limiting the damage. Without these weapons, the losses suffered by the American fleet might have been far greater. For Japanese pilots, the experience was grimly different. Many of them had taken off believing that determination alone might carry them through the American defenses. Instead, they often found themselves flying into a sky filled with explosions. Aircraft ahead of them disappeared in sudden bursts of fire, while defensive shells detonated all around their own planes. Even the most determined pilot could do little against such overwhelming firepower. By the time the Battle for Okinawa finally began to draw toward its conclusion, one fact had become clear to nearly everyone involved. The kamikaze strategy had inflicted real damage on the Allied fleet, but it had not been enough to stop the invasion. The ships remained in place, continuing to support the troops fighting on the island. And among the many weapons that had helped make that survival possible, the Bofors 40mm gun stood out as one of the most important. What had once been dismissed by some Japanese planners as just another defensive weapon had proven itself in the most intense naval air battle of the Pacific War. For the sailors who had stood behind those guns during the long weeks off Okinawa, the conclusion was simple. When the Bofors guns were firing, the fleet still had a chance to live. By June 1945, the long and brutal struggle for Okinawa was finally coming to an end. After nearly 3 months of relentless combat on land, sea, and in the air, the island was effectively under Allied control. For the soldiers fighting across the muddy hills and fortified caves of Okinawa, the battle had been one of the bloodiest of the entire Pacific War. But for the sailors who had defended the fleet offshore, the campaign had been something equally terrifying. A constant battle against waves of aircraft determined to crash into their ships. The final statistics of the campaign revealed just how intense the air attacks had been. During the Battle of Okinawa, Japanese forces launched thousands of aircraft against the Allied fleet. More than 1,000 of those were kamikaze attacks, with pilots deliberately diving their planes into ships in a desperate attempt to inflict maximum damage. The results were devastating, but not decisive. Several dozen Allied ships were sunk during the campaign, and hundreds more were damaged by kamikaze strikes or near misses. Thousands of sailors were killed or wounded in these attacks. Yet despite the ferocity of the Japanese effort, the fleet remained operational. The massive invasion force continued to supply and support the troops fighting on Okinawa, and the American naval presence in the region only grew stronger as the battle progressed. A major reason for that survival was the defensive firepower of the fleet itself. Warships surrounding Okinawa had been equipped with some of the most advanced anti-aircraft systems ever deployed at sea up to that point. Radar-directed fire control systems allowed guns to track incoming aircraft with remarkable accuracy. Fighter aircraft launched from carriers intercepted attackers before they reached the fleet. And across the decks of nearly every major ship stood the weapons that had become so familiar during the campaign. The Bofors 40mm automatic gun M1 guns. By the end of the battle, these guns had fired millions of rounds of ammunition. They had engaged thousands of incoming aircraft and destroyed a large portion of them before they could reach their targets. Their reliability and effectiveness had been tested under the most extreme combat conditions imaginable, and they had proven themselves again and again. Many American sailors later recalled that the distinctive thunder of the Bofors guns had become one of the defining sounds of the Okinawa campaign. When the guns opened fire, crews knew that another attack had begun, but they also knew that those weapons gave them a fighting chance to survive it. For the Empire of Japan, the failure of the Kamikaze campaign to stop the Allied advance was a devastating realization. Although the attacks had inflicted serious losses, they had not achieved their ultimate goal of preventing the invasion of Okinawa. The American fleet had endured the storm of suicide attacks and continued operating in the region. Japanese pilots had demonstrated extraordinary determination, but determination alone could not overcome the immense industrial and technological advantages of the Allied forces. As the war moved closer to its final months, the lessons learned during the Okinawa campaign began influencing military thinking around the world. The effectiveness of naval anti-aircraft defenses, especially medium-range weapons like the Bofors gun, became a subject of intense study. Military planners recognized that modern naval warfare would increasingly be defined by the struggle between attacking aircraft and defensive firepower. In that struggle, weapons like the Bofors had proven their value beyond any doubt. The gun's design had achieved a rare balance between power, reliability, and rate of fire. Its 40mm explosive shells were large enough to destroy most aircraft with only a few hits, while its automatic firing mechanism allowed gun crews to maintain a steady stream of fire against fast-moving targets. The weapon could be mounted on ships, vehicles, or stationary positions, making it extremely versatile in different combat environments. Because of these advantages, the Bofors gun did not disappear when World War II finally ended. Instead, it continued to serve in the arsenals of many countries around the world. Naval vessels, ground-based air defense units, and even armored vehicles adopted various versions of the weapon. During the early years of the Cold War, the gun remained one of the most widely used anti-aircraft systems in existence. It would appear again on battlefields during the Korean War, where it was used by United Nations forces to defend positions against aircraft and ground targets. Even decades later, upgraded versions of the Bofors design continued to appear in military service. For historians looking back at the Pacific War, the battle for Okinawa stands as one of the clearest demonstrations of the importance of anti-aircraft defense in modern naval warfare. The Kamikaze campaign showed how dangerous determined air attacks could be, even against powerful fleets. But the defensive systems developed by the Allied navies also proved that well-designed weapons and disciplined crews could withstand even the most desperate assaults. Among those defensive systems, the Bofors 40mm gun earned a reputation that has endured for generations. It was not the largest weapon on a warship, nor the most technologically complex. Yet, during the long weeks off Okinawa, it became one of the most important guardians of the fleet. From the perspective of the Japanese pilots who flew toward the American ships in those final months of the war, the sky above the fleet must have seemed like a wall of explosions. Aircraft vanished in bursts of fire, while defensive shells filled the air around them. Many of those explosions came from the same weapon that had once been dismissed as just another gun. In the end, the story of the Bofors 40mm gun at Okinawa is not simply a story about a piece of military technology. It is a story about how preparation, engineering, and human skill combined to shape the outcome of a battle. The gun that some had underestimated became one of the most effective defenders of the Allied fleet during one of the most dangerous campaigns of the war. And for the sailors who stood behind those guns, while kamikaze aircraft screamed out of the sky toward their ships, the legacy of that weapon would never be forgotten.